Okay, well, welcome to our digital class on the Cold War. So, when we last left each other, our conversation had been about how World War II had been a war for civilization. And then when we came to the end of that unit, what we discussed was how the Cold War was something that was beginning even as the peace settlements were trying to be established at the meetings of Yalta and Potsdam in the early portions of 1945. And one of the things I tried to point out was that why I at least argue that the Cold War was beginning is that you had the two sides, the British, the French, and the Americans, sort of deciding that Germany would be divided among them. And then for the Soviet Union, they decided that Germany would get, they would get a portion of at least East Germany. So what you have happening, at least, is that there's a good indication that the alliance that had seen the destruction of Hitler was starting to falter. And that is especially true once we get out of 1945 and then into 1946 and onward. And one of the things that happened, is that you start to see that, particularly for the Soviet Union, they start to get what we call buffer states or satellite states. And however you use the term, I think will help define sort of how you see these states, right? So if you think of them as buffer states, so here's obviously the Soviet Union, and these are their buffer states, right? So you have Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, acting as buffers to protect the Soviet Union from invasion, right? Or if you think of them as satellites, right, they are sort of, a satellite is something that hovers around the main body. You can think of them as satellites, right? Sort of in the gravitational pull of the Soviet Union, if you will. And the expansion of the Soviet Union into those territories and the thinking of those as either buffer states or satellites, I think is helpful in terms of the idea of how we visualize or conceptualize the beginning of the Cold War. And we start thinking of it as a way in which these countries are starting to have greater amounts of autonomy over their areas, right? And even that, I mean, that's certainly true for the West as well, right? For the British, French, and Americans in East Germany, right? And we'll talk about East Germany in just a second. West Germany, that is. In West Germany, you have the division of the country into, again, three sort of spheres, and that's the British, French, and the American sections. So again, that would not be uncommon. You're going to read in a document that I've posted about the Iron Curtain, right? So there is this Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill discusses, and it is a metaphor that Churchill uses to describe this larger divide that's happening between the East and the West, and that is that there is sort of this impenetrable divide that happens between the democracies on the one side and the communists on the other. So what I'm already trying to point out to you, or at least lay the groundwork to here, is that there is a growing separation among the former allies, right? The people who had put down Hitler from 1939 until 1945 are now no longer really seeing eye to eye, and then they're not willing to really cooperate with one another. And that is becoming more evident through the late 1940s. And for the Americans, at least, and since this is an American history course, it's important to talk about this, right? So for the Americans, at least, there are political philosophies that are dominant here, right? When the Soviet Union had turned communist after the revolution in the 19 teens, and then ultimately at the end of the Civil War in 1921, what you have is this fear that there are going to be other countries that are going to become communist. And one of the ideas that starts to circulate is this idea of domino theory. And this is the fear that if one nation falls to communism, the rest will fall too. And when the Soviet Union becomes communist in 1921, ultimately, and then especially after China becomes communist in 1949, those fears are very much realized. And once China has become communist, the fear is that next Korea will fall, which it ultimately does. Vietnam will fall, which it ultimately does, and then it'll swing around sort of East and Southeast Asia. So then these political philosophies start to emerge where there is these ideas of trying to contain communism, trying to stop communism from spreading, right? Communism is seen as this, or visualized as this fire. If you can stop it from spreading, it will ultimately suffocate and die out. So we start to try and have the idea of containing it. Don't let it expand from where it is, but keep it where it is now. However, if you can't fight communism, if you can't stop communism spreading, then what you need to do is make sure that communism does not seem appealing to other places of the world. And that is the idea of the Truman Doctrine, and that's a document that you'll be reading as well. The Truman Doctrine is this idea that you must make sure that countries don't become communist. And for the United States, that is exemplified in loaning a lot of money out to our allies. And that comes in the idea of what is called the European Recovery Plan, or more colloquially known as the Marshall Plan, named for George Marshall, who was the Secretary of State. This was a sum of money to the tune of about $13 billion given loaned, I should say, to countries in order to invest in and buy American products, but also to invest in themselves, right? So in Germany, in West Germany, that is, there is a massive economic recovery, so that the country itself becomes extremely wealthy, and it's called the West German miracle because of its rampant industrial productivity. So you have these events that are occurring, that are making, that are, again, setting out these dividing lines. Now, why is that? There is this massive fear from both the West and the East, right, from the communists and the democracies alike, that neither one can survive while the other is still around. And the fear there is one that is extremely dominant and one that is really governing how they deal with each other. So that what happens is you have a massive amount of hostility and tension, but also a lot of coercion going on behind the scenes. So you have, particularly Harry Truman, who is president in the late 1940s, and then you have Dwight D. Eisenhower in the early 1950s, really working on covert action to try and subvert the other side. Those are the two presidents, I should say. Along with that, you also have alliances popping up, right? So for the democracies, you have the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is meant as a protection of all of the groups, right? It's a protection that, as I say here, 12 nations wind up joining, the ones that you would expect: United States, Canada, Britain, France, West Germany, and many others wind up joining. And those are countries that are going to be there to protect each other should anything happen to one of the member states, right? So if one member state is attacked, the others will come to their support. And then a few years later, the same is created for the communist nations, called the Warsaw Pact. And these are two alliances dividing up the world, right, over fears over what would ultimately happen. We're going to come back to this in just a second. But what I want to look at here is, what does this mean in terms of real application, right? There's this development of an arms race, right, where both sides, the British, the French, and the Americans, and then the Soviet Union and its allies, wind up spending a huge amount of money trying to outdo the other in terms of military expansion and military development. So that by the 1950s, the United States has something like 30,000 nuclear warheads. And a few years later, the Soviet Union winds up surpassing them. It is a huge amount of investment. You're talking hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars going into the development. But it's also one where they're developing this idea of mutually assured destruction. And this becomes a type of foreign policy where you are guaranteeing the other's ultimate destruction should you wind up having any encounter with the other, right? So if the United States drops an atomic bomb on Russia, the Soviet Union, the United States is mutually assured that they will be destroyed as well because of this, right? So why then attack the other over this fear, right? So it's a way that they have basically guaranteed that we will destroy each other should we ever have to use these nuclear warheads. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that we have divided up the world. We have each drawn our sides and drawn our barriers, but we've also made it so that mutual conversation can't even be had because destruction is so imminent. And then we have, so the illustration that I'm trying to say here, I guess, is that in the first 30 years of the Cold War, from 1945 really until about 1975 or so, is what I define as the early Cold War. And in a few weeks, we're going to talk about the late Cold War. And I'm going to try and compare and show you how those two periods are very different philosophically. I'm going to post another video that'll help explain the actions, and then in that video we'll talk about Korea, Vietnam, the Bay of Pigs, and the Cuban incidences. But what I'm trying to illustrate here, and I'll go back to this slide, is that in the early Cold War, from roughly 1945 really until about 1972, you have what I call the early Cold War. The early Cold War is a period where the philosophical ideas of domino theory, containment, and then the Truman Doctrine are really your defining philosophical foreign policy ideas. They are the ones that are going to be guiding all of the decisions that are coming out of the United States and other democratic countries, trying to make sure that communism is kept at bay. And that is also why there are the sort of hot moments of the Cold War, where you have invasions being had, and you have the Bay of Pigs incident, or you even even before that, right? You have the proxy war between so a proxy war is a war that's not between the two major combatants, not between the United States and the Soviet Union, but rather happening in North and South Korea, or the same would be true a few years later in Vietnam. So you have these events that are hot moments of great tension within the Cold War. And that is emblematic of what I call the early Cold War. The later Cold War, which will happen from roughly 1972 until 1992, is one where tensions are still there, and I'm not going to say that they go away entirely, but we categorize it more by a word called détente, this idea of diffusing tension. And I think you'll see that in a couple weeks. So the documents that I'm going to post will help sort of see the tensions that exist, and then I also will post a video about those hot actions. So thank you.